I'm Mark Ellis. Welcome to the Authentic Self podcast. How is it that we end up being controlled by our past experiences and other people's expectations of us? And how do we break that cycle? To discuss this, I'm joined by Tamar Grunewald from Quantum Potential. Tam, hi.
Hey, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Welcome to the Authentic Self podcast.
The Authentic Self podcast. Now that's a brilliant name.
Perhaps you could start off just by explaining how our early life experiences shape how we see ourselves in later life.
Yeah, well, it's such an interesting topic because when you're born as this bundle of body, and your mind still needs to be filled with lots and lots of things. So it's such a fascinating age from the age from 0 to, let's say, 2, because you're just like this sponge that is absorbing all this information from the outside world and the people around you. And you've got all this space in your mind that is just being filled with stimuli and sounds and sights, and as you get older, learning to speak and learning to walk and all this stuff. So there's nothing in a child from 0 to 2 that stops it from learning. Nothing. It absorbs everything. I'm sure if you've had children, you've seen this yourself. You don't have to force a child to learn how to walk or learn how to speak. It kind of just happens along the way. Of course, you encourage and you talk to your child, and you might read to your child, and that all helps. But the child actually seems to take on information in a very fascinating way that kind of stops after a while. So yes, as a young child, when you're learning to walk, for example, you see all these people around you walking, and you kind of know that that's the next thing to do. You don't really realize why that's the next thing to do, but it's just inbuilt in our DNA that we learn to walk at a certain age. And you don't stop learning to walk until you've learned to walk. You don't sit down one day and say, I'm fed up of this. I can't do it. I'm just going to sit here. Somebody will bring me around for the rest of my life. You just keep going until you've learned to walk. And it's a very difficult process. It's not an easy process. First you have to learn to crawl, then you have to learn to get up and stand and hold on to something, and then you have to take this really amazing step, this first step with no support or anything, and you do it. Everybody learns to walk, or most people learn to walk. If they've got the faculty in their legs, they learn to walk. But then later on in life, when something that you really want to achieve is in front of you, but it gets difficult, very often we give up. So why is that? That's the interesting part of this. As a child, you don't see any obstacles. You just focus on the outcome. Yet when we're a bit older, that can often change. We still see the focus and the outcome, but we allow barriers to get in the way.
And that sort of situation you talked about, as people get older, they stop that ability to learn like a child. What kind of problems, in your experience, does that create for people?
Oh, a huge amount of problems. So if you, at some point in your life, have been told, let's take, for example, that you're not that great at maths, for example, and you're told by your teacher that you're not that great at maths, or you're told then by your parents, oh, for goodness sake, how can't you do this? It's so simple. And you're sat there going, I have no idea what that number and that number have got to do with each other. Then you can quite readily, as a child, take on that learning. Not the learning that maths is difficult for you, but the learning that I am stupid. Now, if you learn a few things like that as a child, like I'm stupid, I'm not very good at this, I can't concentrate, I find this difficult, then that can massively stop you in later life from daring to take on anything new. You're not that child anymore that's standing and wanting to walk without any barriers in the way. You're this person who has a myriad of programs locked in your head going, I'm not very clever, I'm stupid, I can't do this, I can't focus. So what do then? You don't just continue with your outcome and focus on what you want. You allow those other learnings that you've picked up on the way to get in the way of your outcome, and you just stop.
Okay, so we're in a situation where people are constrained, blocked. They develop this, I suppose, a bit of a complex really about these type of situations based on something that they've learned negatively as a child that stuck with them. What are the steps to get beyond that? How do you resolve that?
Well, it's a really interesting process, and this is what we do at Quantum Potential is deal with these kind of issues, because as you grow up, you have no barriers as a child to what you absorb as learning. There's no barrier yet to entry, if you like. So if someone says you're not very clever or you're actually stupid, or why do you think you do things like that, that's ridiculous. Those get embedded in the deeper part of your mind like a little program, just like on a computer. And then later on in life, when you want to go and try and do something, that program just pops up and says, no, you can't do that. So obviously, knowing that this happens, there has to be a way to reprogram the mind. Like, so you've got this software in there. How can we reprogram it, if you like? And that's what interests me the most about how the mind works and how you can make massive changes with people in not too long a time period. Because you can almost take that program that says, I'm not very good at whatever it is, and lift it out of your mind and write it down on a piece of paper. And once you've written it down, you can find memories that you've linked with that in your mind. So let's take, for example, myself. I was never very good at taking exams. And it wasn't until my final year in university that I figured it out, how to do it. And how I figured it out was that I realized that what was happening in an exam situation was that I would get very, very stressed. So when I was going through my GCSEs, my parents were going through a divorce. So I had linked the stress of my parents' divorce to my exam angst, and therefore thought that I was useless at exams. So in my final year of university, it was just that I was talking to someone about exams and how I felt about exams and how I always felt stress. And because they knew me from my younger years, they said, but when you were doing your GCSEs, weren't your parents going through this divorce? And I go, actually, yes. And she was saying, well, isn't that interesting? Maybe it's not really exam angst that you're feeling when you go to an exam. It's the angst of your parents going through the divorce and you wanting to do well on top of everything else. And so what I did to change that was I wrote down my memories from doing my GCSEs and what was going on home. And I realised that what was happening was that because of what was going on in the house, I would stay up late at night to do my work when everybody was quiet. But then I wasn't getting enough sleep or rest or whatever it was. So I wrote all this out. And then what I did was I took those memories and I rewrote them. Because this is what you need to know about how your mind works. Your mind does not know the difference between real and imaginary, because everybody has a different concept of what happened way back when. So it's only a perspective that you hold anyway. So is there any truth in it anyway? It's only one person's perspective. So I wrote down what was in my head, that little program about my exam angst when I was younger. Then I rewrote it. And I rewrote it in a very positive framework. So I didn't ignore the fact that my parents were going through divorce. I explained to myself that the angst of my parents going through divorce was completely normal and valid, and that angst was absolutely got to do with the divorce and not my exams. So I kind of rewrote my own program and put it in my mind as memory. And that is a very handy tool to use if you want to rewrite anything that you've had in the past, however negative that might have been.
So that process of writing stuff down, why is that so important, do you think?
I think it's really important because you don't really know what's in there. You don't really know what's in your head. You don't really know what your thoughts are until you start writing them down. Like, for example, if someone has an issue with interviewing, let's just take that as an example. How do you know what that issue is? You just know you don't like to be in an interview, or you feel scared or stressed or whatever, but you don't really know why. If you start writing down, ask yourself the question at the top of the page, why have I got this anxiety about being in an interview? You'll get a shock at what comes out of your pen. It's such an interesting process to go through. It really teaches you an awful lot about yourself. And once you've got it down there, number one, you can often look at it and go, but that's ridiculous, because these things get lodged in our mind in very odd ways. It doesn't mean it makes sense. And sometimes as soon as you see it written down, you go, but that's ridiculous. And it disappears for you straight away. So it's a really interesting process to do. You should give it a go, definitely.
Okay, so if someone's listening to this, as they hopefully will be, and wants to try and identify for themselves what are some of those experiences that are kind of limiting them or blocking them or creating problems for them, how would you recommend they start?
I'd recommend you start with the most obvious ones. Everybody has some things that are either a bit of a phobia or something that they don't feel they're that great at. So start with the obvious ones. Like, for example, if you can't swim or you're scared of water, there's a very obvious one that you can start with. And if that will definitely be linked to some kind of small or large trauma as a child. And just write down the experiences of that and take a look at what you've written afterwards. Or some people have a very obvious issue, say, with standing up and speaking in front of a room of people. So where does that come from? Were you made fun of in the playground as a child? Or it's just an interesting process. You'll learn something about yourself, I promise you that for sure. Yeah. But I'd start with the most obvious ones, the ones that you would say to yourself, oh yes, I've always had that about this.
Making that change, confronting these issues, which I'm guessing for some people have bogged them down for years, that's going to be quite a stressful experience, isn't it? How would you advise them to deal with or cope with that stress? And what does that stress mean?
Okay, well, the stress is a protection mechanism. It's protecting you from going back there. And I'm talking about maybe starting doing this kind of work with very simple things, not with the deepest ones that you can find. Like, for example, why do my relationships always fail on me? That's a really deep issue, and you might want to wait with those kind of ones until you're a bit proficient with the easier ones. But to deal with the stress of that, first of all, number one, you have to figure out Are you ready to make a change? That's the biggest question you should ask about doing any kind of mind work, because you don't have to make a change. And you have to be ready for it. Because if you're not ready for it, you might take yourself further away from the outcome that you want. So number one would always be, am I ready to make a change in this area of my life? And if you really are ready to make a change, then the stress around it will dissipate a little bit, because the outcome becomes more important than the stress related to it, because you really want to look at it. And then you have to be really kind to yourself, because a lot of this stuff that you've stored in your head hasn't been from you. You've taken on so many programs and learnings from other people, and they've taken that on from other people. So just because you're born in the north, perhaps, you might have a different accent from someone that's born in the south. That is definitely not come from you. That's come from your environment and your surrounding. And then someone that's born in, say, Africa compared to someone that's born in Scotland, they're going to have different lives just because of the environment around them. So that highlights that your environment has a massive input into what you've learned. Because as a child, you had no barriers. So you didn't say to yourself, no, I don't like that Scottish accent. I'm going to get myself a Geordie accent or a Scouser accent. Do you know what I mean? You didn't have that barrier. You just absorbed what was around you. So a lot of the stuff in your head isn't yours. And that's the key here. Because if you want to try and change that, then you can say to yourself, I don't own this stuff. It's not really mine. I want to own what's in my own head. And that is where it gets exciting, because you can change anything that's in your head.
The authentic self. So, you've been helping people one-to-one and in small groups as part of your Quantum Potential program. Tell us a bit about that.
So Quantum Potential was born out of a retreat I did in Crete in 2017. And I asked a very good friend of mine, Catherine, to come along and do the yoga with the students, because I thought it would be a really complementary thing to the mind work that I do, to have this yoga, this body work that kind of mirrored what I did with the mind, but on a physical level. When something's bothering you physically, when you're in pain or when you're hurting physically, it has exactly the same mirror effect when something's hurting you in your mind, and they affect each other. So if you can relax away the pain physically, you can often relax away stress and anxiety mentally. And the connection between the two is really important. So we figured that we could put together a very comprehensive system where you are absolutely using both your mind and your body to get to this place that is balance for you. And that is the key to what we're doing with Quantum Potential, is finding this balance. And within that balance, there's a space. And that space offers the answers to any kind of questions that you might have. But when you're not in balance, you don't find that space where the answers are.
And how do people access that?
Well, we are presently doing a 6-month course, which is booked, but our next 6-month course will start in January of next year. That's 2020. And we have workshops. Our next workshop is on the 13th of April, and we will have another couple of workshops this year. And we also offer our famous Crete retreat, which will run from the 5th to the 12th of October in Crete. And information on all those courses can be found on our website at www.quantum-potential.co.uk. And we're also on Facebook, and you can also get in contact with me on LinkedIn, just under my name, Tamar Grunewald.
Tam, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, too.